Good morning. Now, Mr. Connell, I think we're ready to begin with Mr. Hill.
We are, who appears remotely.
Right. Good morning, Mr. Hill. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, very clearly. Good morning.
Excellent. We can hear you clearly too. Now, as you understand, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. Connell. But first, I understand you're agreeable to take the oath.
I am.
Sitting where you are, could I ask you to raise your right hand and repeat these words after me? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by mighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Now, as I understand it, you're joining us from Spain. Am I right about that?
You're correct.
Right. Now, I suppose that you're probably an hour ahead of us. We're now at 10 o'clock.
Yes, it's 11 o'clock here.
11 o'clock. Right. Our timing will be that we will sit between now and what is 1 o'clock for us, taking a coffee break at what is 11:30 for us or thereabouts. But if at any stage you want to take a break, just give me an indication and we will take a break for whatever reason. Whether your evidence will take the whole morning, I don't know at this stage, but I'll now hand you over to Mr. Connell.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Hill.
Good morning.
I think it's a good time to be in Spain, looking out the window in Edinburgh. It's not very clement here. You prepared a witness statement, which has been given to the inquiry. So I ask you, first of all, the formal question that I ask everybody, which is, are you content to adopt that statement as part of your evidence?
I am.
Thank you. Now, just before I ask you the next question, by way of explanation, in order to speed the process of obtaining from various participants any questions they might want to ask particular witnesses, the inquiry circulated a number of statements when they were still in draft form, giving an explanation. These were, of course, at that stage, only drafts. Now, at the time that was done, and yours was one of those statements, in June, of the questions asked in the section dealing with communications, not all of the sections had been completed by you, and in particular one answer hadn't been completed, which is now question 37 on the version that we have today. Now, I can look it up if you need me to, but it's simply the question in which you're asked about the statement you're said to have made about Mr. Redfern and Dr. Inkster not to speak to Professor Kadihi, and we'll come to the substance of that later on. I've been asked to ask you...
Can I say one thing? Sorry.
Yes, of course.
I did complete a statement on the paragraph, I think you referred to it as 37, so I'm surprised you've not received it.
Well, I have a version now.
Oh, well, that's fine. Sorry.
The fault is entirely mine. The point was that in the draft that we got, that we had in hand in June, that wasn't completed. Now, I can dig out the draft if you want, but perhaps you just take that from me, that was a section that wasn't completed. And I've been asked to ask you whether there was any particular reason why that answer wasn't completed at that time. It is now, but was there any particular reason why it wasn't completed at that time?
Well, I can't recall because I thought I had completed it, but I take your word from what you said. So therefore, if it was omitted by me, that was a mistake. I should have completed it at the time.
So there wasn't any particular difficulty in completing that answer compared to any other?
None whatsoever.
Was there any reason why your statement only came to the inquiry very recently. It's one of the last we got for this hearing. Was there any particular reason for that?
Well, as you can probably gather, I live in Spain and I have a very active life out here, so I'm not making any excuses. I did read through the documents early on. The one thing I didn't have was throughout my career, I've always had access to my handwritten notes. Unfortunately, being in Spain and the fact that when I finished my career, none of that documentation was obviously retained by me. Therefore, I'm trying to recall from my memory, including the paperwork that was clearly and kindly submitted to me. And therefore, I took my time making sure I racked my brain, if you want to, for the sake of an expression, to recall as accurately as I possibly could. But it's my mission and it's my way of trying to recall, if you like, things that occurred more than 5 years ago and before that.
And long before that, in some cases. When did you actually step down from your post at NHS GGC?
Well, I was sick for about a year beforehand. So in 2021, I no longer was working in the organisation, and in 2022, in March, I finished.
I'm going to use your witness statement as a sort of guide to help us go through the questions, if I may. And I think you have access to that, do you?
Yes.
Yeah. On the first page, obviously, we identify your title that's relevant to our purposes, which was Director of Women's and Children's Services. Now, for those of us who are not intimately familiar with the structures of NHS GGC, can you give us just a very brief snapshot of what that job actually entailed?
So you have responsibility for, as it describes, women and children. So for this particular post, women's services were maternity. They were the the infertility services, a whole range of other gynecological services. So it's the entirety of what you call women's services, including maternity services, including midwifery and community midwifery across the whole of the Greater Glasgow and Clyde Board. There was also then, in that respect, the children's services, which was the main children's hospital, a ward in the the Royal Alexandra Hospital in Paisley, and the services linking to the community, but we did not have, or I did not have responsibility for community children's services. In addition to that, you've got links with labs linked to genetic testing and various other things for children. And overall, 3,000 plus staff, a budget of 400 million, and direct reports through the organisational structure that I'm sure you've seen. My responsibilities are therefore, from a governance point of view, were to be responsible for, if you like, the corporate governance of the directorate, the clinical and operational aspects of it, financial, but including the budgets and everything else, through my general managers and others with direct responsibility, and also for the, if you like, health and safety and various other aspects, links to trade unions and everything else with staff side and others. There's an extensive list, but I'm happy to carry on doing the list. Is that sufficient?
No, that will suffice for present purposes. Thank you very much. Part of the reason I asked you was that in the course of this inquiry, we've discovered that lots of parts of the organisation have people called directors and things called boards, but these are not always directors and boards as a person in the outside world would understand it. But your post as Director of Women and Children's Services was one of the senior positions. Is that right, at the sort of top level, reporting only to the Chief Executive?
Sorry, yeah, I reported into Director of Operations, who reported direct to the Chief Executive. Yeah.
So you were in that sort of top layer of management. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, I don't think we'll...
Sorry, probably my fault, Mr. Hill. I noted you were saying I reported to the Director of Operations. Is that same as the Chief Operating Officer, or is it someone?
Oh, sorry. Yes, it is, Chief Operating Officer.
Chief
Yes, my
Operating
fault.
Officer. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to put up the organisation chart, I suspect, because we can all read that, and apart from anything else, the print is depressingly small. But we'll move on. Can we go to page 4? That's the next page of your witness statement. Just so I can understand the point that you make here. You're asked, well, describe the procedures and governance in place within Women and Children's Services. And you then say, I designated the Chief of Medicine to take the lead role as a practicing clinician. So do you distinguish what that person was meant to do from other parts of governance? Is that right?
Correct. Because as a non-clinician, I feel that it's important for a clinical person to lead the aspects of clinical governance. It's not to say I don't pay attention to it, and did pay attention to it very, very importantly. But the reality is, and also the Chief of Medicine, who's a practicing clinician and who happened to be a consultant obstetrician and gynecologist, therefore represented, if you like, the body of the Kirk and the practicing clinicians, and had influence with them, and also had an ability to interact very clearly and appropriately with the paediatricians and the others in intensive care, and neonatal intensive care, that we were also responsible for. So hence my decision. Everywhere I've worked throughout England and Scotland throughout the last 38 years, I've always designated a clinical person to lead clinical governance, which of course then in turn, he reports into me in this instance. So I'm clear about what's happening, I'm clear about the questions I'm asking, and I'm also clear about trying to obtain those answers in an appropriate way, and seeking guidance from a practicing clinician about what was appropriate to pursue further and what was being dealt with through other channels, and we would await the results of whatever inquiries or investigations we were committing to.
You described yourself as a non-clinician.
Yes.
Was your background essentially as an administrator? Is that
Yes.
how it would be best described?
Yes.
And is that the kind of role that you'd performed earlier in your career?
Yes, I commenced as an administrator or a clerical officer way back in 1981 in the Dumfries and Galloway Health Board, and I progressed and worked to various promoted posts initially in England for 20 years, and then I managed to obtain a post in Glasgow in 2002, and I've been in Glasgow till I finished my career in 2021-22, as described earlier.
The questionnaire, because that's the way that this has been set out, goes on to ask you questions about water safety in clinical areas and so on. And you're asked, well, who's in charge of that? And you say, well, that's an estates matter. So that's primarily director of estates. And then you point out that if there are any issues, then they should really come through the clinical governance side. And that's how you would know about it. Is that right?
Well, not necessarily. They'd come through also the operational hospital side, because clearly if an issue takes place involving water or a defect in terms of the environment, then as much as the Director of Estates is responsible for correcting any deficits, the reality is that the operational people will feel the impact of that right away. So we'd be reporting, problems with taps, problems with showers, mould developing, etc. So there's a two-way process. So I need to reinforce the fact that it's not one person's responsibility, it is a team, but also at the same time we have designated areas of, that's not my area of responsibility, somebody else deals with that, as you would expect from the organisation chart and the size of the organisation.
And when you say that the operational people, who do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, initially it would be the nurse on the ward, the domestic cleaning the shower cubicles. It would be raised to the it could be the patient and the parent raising an issue in the ward environment, and we need to be seen and are seen to deal with it, as in raise it further. I don't expect the nursing and other staff and clinical staff to deal with environmental and facilities issues. We have an organisation structure in place with appropriate people who are skilled in those areas to deal with, if you like, in any corrections and improvements.
Yeah, and I think eventually we turn in the questions to, well, what was your role in all of this? And your answer is that if there are issues of concern, it's your job to take them up with the Director of Facilities and Estates and or the Chief Operating Officer. Is that right?
Correct.
So you're a sort of conduit rather than a decision taker. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
Now, I want to ask you something that crops up on page 6. I'm not necessarily going to ask you to go through every word in your witness statement, otherwise we would be here for longer than we have available. But at the top of page 6, you're asked about the procurement of this, let's call it the new hospital. This must have been quite a big issue for you, presumably, because here was a new children's hospital coming on stream. Would that be right?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, what you say here is, well, you ask, well, what's your role? And you say your involvement with the commissioning team was in regard to ensuring ward and departmental plans were signed off as being an accurate specification of the user's requirements based upon the purpose and functionality of the patient groups identified. Now, you say that was your involvement. How did you go about ensuring what you've set out there?
Well, first of all, my general manager, Mr. Jamie Redfern, is responsible for the running of the hospital at that stage. And of course, his familiarity and his links directly with all the clinical areas mean that the clinical teams were, as the plans were being progressed, were involved in the kind of layout of the ward, the placing of things such as simply as, where will the PowerPoints go, where will the if you like, your operating theatre, where will the powerful lights and the beams and various other electronic equipment be placed. So it was about making sure the functionality of the new room or the new theatre or the new ward met with the way things were practiced and could be practiced going forward in the future. So that's about room layout. It is not about the other environmental features. I have no role to play and didn't have in what type of air conditioning units are we getting, what kind of air filtration are we having, etc. That was never a feature of any discussions I had. I was working on the basis that they were following the standard, as I thought we were, latest building note guidelines from NHS Scotland. And as a consequence of that, if there'd been any amendments and updates in the time of the building and commissioning of the building, they should have been put in place. That's my understanding of how it works. Having commissioned buildings in England previously, an intensive care unit, that was the approach we took.
I did want to ask you one thing more about this, because you say in that answer, the process of sign-off and approval for each specified area was a designated responsibility of the General Manager, Jamie Redfern. Now, we've had quite a lot of evidence about signing off of layouts and rooms and so on and so forth. And we haven't been able to find anyone else who said that this was Mr. Redfern's responsibility. For instance, Mr. Seaborn didn't seem to put Mr. Redfern in the frame, and I'm not sure Mr. Calderwood does either. So I just wondered why you say that the process of sign-off and approval was a specific responsibility for Mr. Redfern.
Right, so let me correct that. I don't mean it that way. What I meant was Jamie was reassuring me that this document I was about, because I signed off every plan, every room layout. I'm sorry if that doesn't say that. It should have said that.
Sorry, could you just repeat that, please, Mr. Hill? You signed off?
I signed off every room layout and plan for the new hospital building.
Every room layout and plan?
Yes, for each area, each floor, each department.
Of the children's hospital.
The Children's Hospital.
Can I take the opportunity just to take you, as it were, back in time? The contract construction contract was signed in December of 2009. Now, prior to that, what had your involvement been with clinical output specifications?
None.
Had you any involvement
None whatsoever.
It's just, if I can complete my question, did you have any involvement in the planning of ward layouts or clinical output specifications prior to December 2009?
No.
None. Right.
None. I wasn't in post at that time.
I beg your pardon.
Sorry, I wasn't. I was only appointed in 2010 to the Director of Women and Children's post.
Indeed.
And I think I referred somewhere in a statement to the fact that my predecessor, Mrs. Rosalind Crockett, would have been involved in that discussion along with Alan Seaborn and others.
Indeed you did. Right. So, but you were involved in the design development process from 2010, and indeed you signed off in the sense of indicating your approval on behalf of GGC, every room layout and plan for the Children's Hospital during 2010.
Yes, but that was, and I reinforce this, it's the internal fittings such as PowerPoints, if you like, power cables, etc. Where were they going to be? Where were the PowerPoints going to be located? Where was the equipment going to be? Was it adequate number of PowerPoints? It's very simple in real terms, but it sounds like I'm signing off the entire plan. I wasn't. I was asking Mr. Redfern to reassure me that the clinical teams had seen all these plans, the plan layout, the ward layout, and were comfortable to sign it off on the basis it reflected their requirements as they stood at that time, etc.
Mr. Connell?
So that was, you think, in 2010, would that be right?
Oh no, it was sometime after 2010. It wasn't immediately as I turned up into post, but it must have been within the first year of being there, because it was the first thing. One of the main things to do that year was just to confirm with you, has everyone signed them off? And I'd asked for a clinical director or the lead person, clinician, to sign off the plans with Jamie's name alongside it, with mine to finally approve it, so that we were clear in the organisation that the people that should have been involved in who were going to inherit that new area for working were comfortable with the way it was laid out.
Right. So
Sorry for being so slow about this. Did you simply, before indicating your approval by signing layouts and plans, did you simply rely on Mr. Redfern's assurances, or did you do something else?
No, I asked him to complete the process, given the fact that, as you rightly have said, the plan was already, the layout of the wards, or the structure for the ward environment was already signed off in 2009. So there was no way we were going to be able to adapt or change things in that regard, unless there was something critical that the clinical teams had said. We were also holding a monthly meeting regarding the commissioning of the new hospital. So at that meeting, I would have the entirety of my clinical directorate team, as well as my planning manager, as well as Jamie Redfern and other direct reports, who would all be reporting to me when I asked the questions about where are we now with the planning for the new hospital? Have you all seen the plans? And have you signed off? Are there any issues arising from them? So I don't recall there being any major issue arising from any of them at that time, because we were not talking about, as I repeated earlier, environmental provision or electrical provision. We were talking about where are these power points and various things going to go. And that's just about making sure when they came to fit the ward properly before commissioning, the electrical points were positioned in the places people needed them in order to functionally attach equipment and other things to patients and to care.
So, really to repeat the point, were you relying on what you were told at these monthly meetings of your own team?
Yes.
Right.
And of course the commissioning team, because they were also present, I should add. Mary McLeod was present at every one of our management meetings during the build process.
When you use the expression commissioning team, you mean the project team?
Sorry, project team, yes. Yeah.
Mr. Connell?
So in fact, although your statement, as we might read it, in print today, suggests that Mr. Redfern was having to sign things off, he was simply assisting the process of getting information to you for you to sign it off. Is that right?
Correct. Finally sign it off. Yeah.
Finally sign it off. And so far as issues like water and ventilation, which was the next question on your questionnaire, your answer is that you're anticipating and expecting all of this to be done to the latest standards as set out in the latest guidance. Now, that's what you're anticipating. Are you doing anything to ensure that, for instance, the guidance needed for any particular service is available, or that the specification for any particular ward is available as part of the process, or is that nothing to do with you?
Well, it's not really my responsibility, because clearly people were responsible as the project team for building an appropriate standard of hospital, including the areas that require above a standard regular specification, for example, with ventilation and air handling, etc. So I don't see it, that wasn't my direct responsibility. Therefore, I was working on the basis that everywhere else I'd worked, and including where we worked commissioning, for example, the infertility units inside Greater Glasgow and Clyde, commissioning catheter labs, we built them to the standard that was given at the time. And if we knew there was some change coming ahead, we'd try and find out what that change was going to mean and whether we could incorporate it into the design before we built it. So therefore, that's all I can say.
So the clinical output specifications for, let's say, a specialist ward or a ward which needed particular treatment, that was done before you came into post, I think, prior to 2009. And you weren't involved in that process, as you told the chairman.
Yeah. Yes.
And your anticipation, as you set out on page 6, is if there are any issues which are departing from whatever the guidance is, then that would go through a process depending on what the nature of the departure is. Is that right?
Yeah, there should have been a derogation, as it's referred to say, why are we not doing the following? And what are the consequences of not doing that following? Some of which might be budgetary, but others might well have an impact on the safety for patients.
Yeah. And you make the point at the foot of page 6 that your assumption, in part based on your experience, as you say, of building buildings in England in your previous elements of your career, is that new buildings should meet the current standards. And you point out that's particularly important for those who have immunocompromised situations.
Certainly.
Now let me just move. The logic of the order in the questionnaire is not always ideal, but we'll just stick to that to make life easier. If we just move on to page 7. I think that we start to get here an issue which crops up with a number of witnesses, which is, well, if there's an issue, if there's a problem, if there's an allegation that something isn't being done properly or something isn't being responded to, how do you deal with that in the systems that were in place when you were there? Now, your answer to that, I think it's fair to say, focuses on using the line management system to deal with any issues or concerns. Is that fair?
That's correct.
You say specifically on page 7, these issues and concerns were able to be reported directly to line managers, and this approach was encouraged and supported by professional associations. This was the main route. Now, at the end of that paragraph, you then say there's a whistleblower policy in place to encourage and ensure concerns are able to be raised confidentially. Perhaps a little difficult to fit the two together very easily. Do you have a view as to what the appropriate route for any concern ought to be?
Yeah, so put the whistleblower policy to one side. I think the main route should always be, and I always practice it throughout my career, has been talk to the staff, talk to your line managers, and talk to your clinical teams. So we have various meetings that take place. Whether I attend them all personally or not is not the issue. That's why we have an organisational structure. So the direct reports that report into me, if there are issues being raised, they should be raised with me, full stop. We then have to decide whether those issues can be handled and managed locally without me taking them any further, i.e. to my direct reports, the people I report to. If it's such an issue that we, once having discussed that with the Chief Operating Officer, for instance, because that's who I directly reported to, then I would prepare a paper, or through clinical governance would prepare a paper. It would be an opportunity to raise issues that were of concern. But I don't mean every single issue. I mean, you have to decide on the priority given the scale and the size of the board. And also the fact that individually, as a director and a previous general manager and others, things in the organisation, I'm more than capable of speaking to my fellow directors and fellow colleagues to say, what are you doing about this? Is this on your radar? How are you dealing with it? What's the timescale? Can we have a meeting to make sure everyone that's involved in this particular concern is going to have an answer, and what is the timescale to resolve that issue? That's the normal approach in an organisation that I have led in my career to date. People who have end up choosing to go elsewhere to raise an issue with a trade union are entitled to do that. But with the trade unions, again, what we'd expect is there would be some feedback into us directly to say, this is of concern, what are we doing about it? So we'd go through the same pattern I've just described before. The whistleblowing policy becomes a bit more, much more difficult and fraught, because people feel very vulnerable about opening their mouths and saying what they truly believe. That's a difficulty in organisations, not just in the NHS, but throughout, if you like, organisations potentially just in the UK for the sake of this discussion. I think it's disappointing when people have to use a whistleblowing policy. Having said that, it's a true avenue for people to express their genuine opinions, and those opinions and views need to be investigated thoroughly, normally through some independent means, in order to get a judgment on whether one side or the other are just disagreeing about something, or whether in actual fact there is evidence to take their concerns further.
I suppose that the question that I probably ought to put to you, given what you've just said, is that if it's well known that a senior official, such as yourself, might be someone else, is disappointed when people have to go down the whistleblowing route, that might be thought to discourage people from doing that, because they know that senior management are.
Oh, no, I sorry. Are you finished that?
Yeah, no, I'll stop there.
No,
in the middle of a sentence, it's fine.
No, sorry, apologies.
No.
So when I say disappointed, I mean it's a route that's legitimately there. I accept that, but I mean from a management point of view, if it's a whistleblower within my part of the organisation, then I hope that they've raised those issues further down the line before they choose to go down the whistleblowing policy. but I don't have any control over that. So what I'm saying is, it is disappointing if that occurs. It's still the right to do so, and I honour and I am respectful of that right. It doesn't stop me from doing the right thing. It just means, have they raised it elsewhere? And has it been tackled elsewhere? Has it been neglected? And if it has, have I and my part of the organisation got any lessons to learn from not having responded appropriately or thoroughly and engaged properly with the individual? That's what I mean.
Thank you. Now, let me just pick up a couple of points of detail briefly. Page 8, you asked a question in the course of discussion about structures and report. How is it decided which issues and reports go where in the system? And you say, well, escalation of issues subject to consideration, deliberation by chief executive officers, etc. And it says the decision-making level was at the discretion of the chief executive. I mean, is that right, that the chief executive just decides at his or her discretion where the point stops?
Well, in my opinion, if he or she considered it to be a requirement to inform the board, then it would become the subject of a board paper. Not every issue that gets raised ends up in front of the board. That's all I'm saying. It depends on the level of the concern. It depends whether the issues have been satisfactorily dealt with already. If they've gone away, if you like, then in some respect, it's a non-reportable issue. But it's not my decision. I'm not at that level. All I know is that not every single issue would appear in front of the board. I mean, we're as I said earlier, a multi-directorate organisation with a number of issues going on every single day, if not repeatedly throughout certain days. And therefore, I would not think, and I know, that not every issue went to the board. That's all I mean.
Can I just ask you this general question? We've had some evidence in this inquiry about a whole series of committees. There seems to be committees, lots of levels of committees operating within NHS GGC at the relevant time that we're looking at. Now, in some of these cases, we have the impression, and I'd like your view on this, that these committees don't actually do anything, in the sense of all that happens is that reports are made to these committees and then they're then noted, or something similar phrase to that, rather than the committees actually taking any direct action themselves. Is that a fair description, do you think, of the way the structure worked when you were there?
I think, first of all, a committee structure is important for the board to make sure it has proper governance in place. I do think they should review the level and number of committees as we go forward every 12 or 24 months, just to make sure that they're still relevant and what is their purpose and are they serving that purpose. Coming back to your point about action, well, usually what happens is a committee they can recommend action, but they can't take any because they're a collective group of individuals with various responsibilities. So depending on the issue, so for example, if there was an issue for women and children's, I would expect the committee chairperson to ask me, or through whoever they report to, or run to the chief exec, or the next level up to whatever committee it was, to say, right, Kevin, can you go and deal with A, B, and C, and can you report back? So in other words, I need to action it because I'm responsible for operational management and planning and structure and everything for that area of my responsibility.
Thank you. Now, I'm probably bouncing back to a point that we got to a little earlier than I had anticipated in one of your earlier answers. If we go to page 9, at the foot of the page, you say there under the heading construction oblique design, this is about the new hospital, I had no involvement or responsibility for construction oblique design of the build, and then you refer to the general manager and the lead nurse and so on getting involved in the layout. We should now read that, presumably, in light of your earlier evidence today about the sign-off process. Is that fair?
That's very fair. Thank you.
Again, an outside reader might think that you were simply saying, I had nothing to do with this. that would not be correct.
That's correct. It would not be correct.
Somewhere we found reference to you giving a presentation about the state of the new building somewhere in 2013. So in other words, while it was being put together. Do you remember anything about that?
Well, no, I don't recall giving a presentation on it, but that may just be an update. I don't know the forum unless someone can advise me further. But it may just have been, this is the layout of the building, these are the levels. I do remember doing something with the planning manager, Janice Hughes, which was about informing people of how the adult hospital was going to be configured and how we were going to be aligned alongside it. Because bear in mind, the original plan was only to build an adult hospital, not a children's hospital. That came as a later decision by the then Minister for Health.
Yes, I had the name at the tip of my tongue and it's gone. Malcolm, somebody, I think.
Malcolm.
Chisholm. Malcolm
Chisholm. I'm obliged, Lord, whose memory of these matters is much better than mine. I might come back to layout a little later because there's a couple of things I want to ask you about, particularly. Can I just then move on to page 10? We're just, in many ways, some of the questions you're being asked either being picked up by other parties as things that they're interested in knowing about or picked up from what others have said. Now, you were asked a question on page 10 about what Mr. Calderwood thought that you might have been involved in the design. And you say, well, I was only there from 2010, and you make the point about Mrs. Rosalind Crockett. And you say that at that point, the actual layouts, in the sense of, there's the ward layouts and numbers of rooms and so on, were pretty much fixed. Is that so?
That's my understanding.
Yeah. So if anyone thought you were involved in design, your involvement would simply be the way you described it earlier today, signing off after getting information from other people below you as to what had happened. Is that right?
Yeah, and Mary McLeod, the project manager, obviously involved in. These are the things we need in these places. Plug points, various electrical supplies, and whatever.
What role was Mary McLeod playing in these discussions?
Well, Mary McLeod, as the Children's Hospital project manager, she was designated as that, and that was her involvement in our management team. She attended our monthly meetings, and she gave an update to the Women and Children's monthly meeting, directorate meeting, on progress with the new build.
One of the issues that's cropped up, Mr. Hill, it centres around the what I might call the skill set of the project team, particularly those who weren't by their nature building professionals, but were largely coming from an administrative or background. Now, you asked one question about that on page 10, which is the distinction between commissioning and validation, and you go on page 11 to say you understand that. Is that something you'd come across before, this distinction between commissioning by the contractor and validation by the client?
Yes.
And you understood that. Was it a surprise to you to learn that validation wasn't done? Or the ventilation system?
Definitely.
You don't remember these things cropping up in any of your discussions with the project team?
Not particularly, because the main aspects of the links to the project team initially was to do with the design of the new building and how we were going to be integrated and the various levels and floors and what was going to be clinically adjacent in terms of theatres to be close to the intensive care unit, etc., things like that. I don't recall us having any discussions about, I mean, validation is one of those things that, in some respect, come back to it. If you bought a car, you'd want to go and test drive it, for example. If you buy an oven, you want to test it, and if it's not working properly, you bring somebody back in. I would have thought any piece of electrical functional system has to be validated. Does it do what it said, what you bought, and what it says on the tin? And if it doesn't do that, then, and if people don't test it, I can't understand how you can commission a building for clinical purposes that are about vulnerable patients, because that's what these additionalities were for. They weren't just the general air conditioning, the turnaround of air changes, the various positive and negative pressures. These things are designed to be standard, but we're now talking about specialist areas that clearly required a certainty and a guarantee that the validation process meant they worked according to the specification. And I'm disappointed that that appears never to have been, or was either addressed or was addressed in ways that I don't know anything about.
And in this context, and I apologise for the form of the question, you are thinking of validation as something carried out by the client in order to satisfy itself that what it has specified has in fact been delivered. That's
correct.
Sorry.
Correct. And also may have to be carried out with the manufacturer or the supplier, because sometimes these are very technical pieces of equipment. But there has to be either a third party brought in on behalf via Scottish Government in order to ensure the validation for these heightened areas of required environmental and air changes are validated properly.
And that would have been a GGC task.
GGC with its partners at Scottish Government, I would have thought.
Thank you.
But your witness statement makes it clear that it wasn't, you didn't think it was your job to check these things because you assumed that these were all being done properly. Is that fair?
Well, correct. I mean, I have no legislation, I have no responsibility for validation. When we get handed a building anywhere else I've been, or a unit or a theatre, the reality is that theatre has been commissioned to design, specified and built to the specification, including any additionality. And then once it's commissioned and validated, the users are invited to come and occupy it after a period of time. So that's my understanding of how normally within an NHS system, England, Scotland, that would apply.
Now, it may just be the way some people use language, but you'll see on page 11, it's been put to you that in his statement, now Mr. Calderwood hasn't given oral evidence yet, that to come later in this session. Mr. Calderwood suggests that you took the decision that the new children's hospital was safe to move children into, which perhaps suggests that you're carrying out some kind of analysis of safety. Is that what you were doing?
No, I was confirming to Mr. Calderwood that the building as such, and having previously visited it along with all our clinical teams and anyone who was moving there, we were happy at that stage. We had issues, we had some snag lists, we had some issues that we needed addressed, and they were identified as part of that walk-arounds with each of the clinical teams going to their own specific areas. None of us were under the impression that we should be, well, can we see the certificates for X, Y, and Z? Can you prove to us? Sorry.
No, carry on, please. We want to hear.
I was just going to say, can you prove to us in hindsight, and it is in hindsight, I mean, obviously the lessons that have been learned since the building, since the building and commissioning and, if you like, validation or otherwise of this building, it clearly has passed validation, because the normal general wards, I understand, are fit for purpose. Other areas appear to have been very, well, Other areas appear not to have been completed to the same standards. I can't comment on that. I wasn't involved in the design specification or the validation process.
What you put in your witness statement on this topic appears at the top of page 12 of your statement, where you mention snagging, and then you've talked to us today about walk rounds, but you say that this didn't involve testing of water drains, air handling, or anything else. That's the
That's
approach
correct.
that you to take. So that your approach to can we move in is based, as you say, on the physical finish of the ward areas rather than on any assessment of the ventilation or water systems. Is that right?
That's correct. Correct, because the testing of water systems sits within the Director of Facilities and Estates, for example.
You were then asked a number of things about how infection control worked. I don't think we need to take you to your general responses, but just to try to get some kind of chronology in our heads. You are asked on page 13, when did you first become aware of concerns raised by IPC about the built environment, whether it's water or ventilation within the hospital? Can you remember when you first heard that there were concerns?
I don't recall the specific dates. I know that there was issues being raised, and those issues were getting raised obviously at local level. Bearing in mind that the infection control doctor, particularly with the Children's Hospital and particularly with what was known as fondly as the Shihallian unit, would be part of their ward round each day or particularly each week. So the reality is that the infection control doctor plays a significant and very local role in observing and hearing and seeing for herself at that stage what was going on and what were the issues. They would then be reported up through our general management team to the facilities and estates people. Very often the ward domestics would come round and supervise and various other things. They would be raising similar concerns if it was about identifiable mould growing. It doesn't look as if that area is clean, etc., etc. But of course, a lot of the things that were going on behind, if you like, within the water systems, within pipework, within behind washboards and showers, sealed shower units and things like that. So they only came to light in reality once further works commenced to investigate further, and hence why we ended up with a series of actions, including ward moves.
Well, let me ask you about the Shihallian unit, Ward 2A, 2B.
Yeah.
You asked the question at the foot of page 13, wearing your hat, and we know now what hat you wear, did you anticipate the ventilation system in 2A would be of equivalent standard or better to that they'd had at York Hill? And you basically answer that yes. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
We look at the top of page 14, you say that it minimum equivalent with any upgrades depending on what the regulations required. That's what you thought was to be done.
I am quite clear on that. That is definitely my honest recollection, and it's my honest opinion.
Can I just ask you? You mentioned there the SHTM, which says the SHTMs plural, which are obviously guidance notes on various topics, including one that we've heard a lot about here, which was SHTM 0301 on ventilation. Do you have any view as to whether Ward 2A was a neutropenic ward as described in that guidance?
No.
Or is that not something you can comment on?
I can't comment on that. cannot comment on that.
And then you're asked whether these...
Sorry,
Sorry.
sorry if I can interrupt. Just want to absolutely clarify it. Why do you say the Shihallian unit was carrying out bone marrow transplants, and it was also dealing with hemato-oncology pediatric patients who were in receipt of other treatments. Why do you say you can't comment on whether that was a neutropenic ward or otherwise?
Because bone marrow transplants take part in a subsection of the ward. Not all the ward would have to have been designated to the same standards. So therefore, there could well be, as there were in the plans, closed rooms, areas that you can treat neutropenic patients in very safely, hence why they need different facilities and air handling and filtration, including obviously taps, filters and everything else. Other patient areas and other patients in that ward are not as vulnerable at certain times, depending on the phases of the treatment they're going through, and therefore some parts of the ward could be more general than the specific bone marrow transplant unit, as you've referred to earlier. So I don't think the whole ward has to be neutropenic, as I said earlier, as I tried to respond, but I do know it has to have a higher standard in those areas where patients' their immunosuppression systems are affected.
That is despite the fact that, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, all areas of 2A would be accessed by patients who were, from time to time, neutropenic to some degree. Am I right in my factual assumption?
Yes, you are.
Right. Thank you.
You go on to say on that page what you've already told us. You can't remember when the issues with 2A were first brought to your attention, but you were concerned if the standards of ventilation weren't what they should have been. And then you're asked, well, do you know who had approved the design of the ventilation for the Shihallian unit before handover, and how that was done and what the explanation was? And you say you just don't know. Is that the position?
That's correct.
Now, if we go back a bit, one of the possible uses that you can make of a thing called a clinical output specification as part of the original planning is to either specify or indicate the kind of environment that you need to create for a special unit. But you weren't involved in that process. Now, Professor Gibson, perhaps to the surprise of many, said that she wasn't involved in putting together the clinical output specification, nor was anyone she knew involved. It seemed to have been done by a manager. Do you have any knowledge of that at all?
No.
And just while I'm on Professor Gibson, a topic, we heard from her that she wasn't happy with the layout that was proposed for the Shihallian unit. There were a range of problems. Pharmacy was sort of being stuck in a cupboard, which she thought was a very important feature. Nurses weren't going to be close enough to the children who might require very swift action, and so on. Now she described raising this with the project team and not not getting particularly helpful responses, just to paraphrase a little. Do you know anything about that at all?
Yeah, I do know that. I think this follows her site visit. I'm sure it was following the site visit, unless she raised it beforehand. But my recollection is, following the site visit, a number of people raised a number of issues. They were all collated together, and they were, if you like, presented to the project team to try and address those issues. Having said that, however, the building was already built when we went round it for obvious reasons, and therefore relocation within the ward area was then subject to operational management with the ward manager to say, should we put the pharmacy instead of in that corner, move it to somewhere else. But bear in mind, everything that goes on in a ward is very important, every aspect of it, otherwise we wouldn't have it in the ward. But the problem becomes when your space is limited, as it always will be in public builds and in other builds, for example. The design was already complete. The building was commissioning or being commissioned, and therefore it was up to us as an operational management team to decide how do we reconcile anybody's concerns. Sorry.
Sorry, my fault, Mr. Hill. When you talk about the site visit, I take it that's the site visit you refer to near the top of page 15 in March of 2015. Yes, thank you.
Correct.
Well, I think it was suggested by Professor Gibson that she made her dissatisfaction known during the process of looking at layouts when people were asked to sign off, as it were, on the layout for the Shihallian. And it was at that design stage that she was raising these concerns about what had been put forward. In fact, to the extent that she declined to sign off the plans for the Shihallian unit. Now, that would be at a time when things were still capable of being changed, potentially. Do you know anything about that?
Well, all I can say is if it was prior to 2010, I know nothing about it other than the fact I understood when I was asked to sign off the layouts, I understood at that time Professor Gibson didn't sign off as the clinical leader for that unit because she still had those concerns.
Sorry, my fault again, Mr. Hill. When you're talking about Professor Gibson's concerns, are we talking about the design development period in 2010, or are we talking about the time of the site visit in March 2015?
So I was referring to the earlier part when the building design was getting signed off and then they were going to commission building against the specification. As I said earlier, I was in post from 2010. So as you've referred to earlier, the building was actually signed off in 2009 as ready to be built to the specification. If Dr. Gibson's concerns had been expressed at that stage, which they may well have been from what I've just heard from Mr. Cook, the reality is that I wouldn't have known that until, of course, I asked for the room layouts, as I'm saying, i.e. the build has already been established, the building is underway, and when we went on the site visit in 2015 in March, I know that Dr. Gibson raised concerns at that stage, which are similar to what you're just describing to me now. But at that stage, of course, the building was built. The structure was in place. The room layouts were already, the room structures and their locations were already configured within the entirety of what you might call 2A and 2B.
I understand that. But what I was looking for help on, were you saying that you were aware in 2010 of Professor Gibson's dissatisfaction with what was proposed, or were you not saying that?
No, I think I was aware she didn't sign the plan because her name wasn't on the plan. So in 2010, if that's when I signed off the plan layouts, Jamie would no doubt have referred to the fact Dr. Gibson's signature's not on this, or no other clinician signatures on it, because they don't agree with the plan. The problem then is even if I raise that, which I'm sure we did raise it up the line, the reality is they're not going to reconfigure the building, bear in mind that the building was already underway.
Thank you.
Well, let's come to 2015 and to the discovery that there were not HEPA filters in some B&T rooms we're still talking about 2A. Now, firstly, would you agree with me that that's a serious issue, the absence of HEPA filters?
Well, specifically in 2A, yes, it was a serious issue.
Yes. And does it not raise a second question? Well, first of all, why are there no HEPA filters? The simple one. Second question is, how can this hospital have been validated when there are no HEPA filters here against the standards that you would have expected? Does it not raise that question as well?
Yes, it possibly does. But as I understood it, what had happened was the builder had fitted standard sinks throughout the entirety of the hospital. I'm talking Children's Hospital. And thereafter, it was discovered that the types of sinks that were fitted did not have HEPA filters on them. So they ended up with a phased approach to replacing sinks with HEPA filters or adjusting the tap design, etc. I remember lots of conversations taking place about design of sinks, size of sinks, splashback from the bowl itself, the way the water flowed out the tap, etc. So lots of conversations took place. My understanding is that was addressed through our estates and facilities colleagues as part of the, if you like, refitting certain things that hadn't been put in place at that time. I don't know whether they were ever specified in the original specification.
Well, the fault may be mine, but I was understanding that the absence of HEPA filters was from the ventilation system in the BMT room.
Sorry, apologies. My mistake. I thought you were meaning the reference to taps. My apologies.
Okay, well, when you're asked about this in your witness statement on page 15, you say you were made aware of it. Can't remember who. Then you said, I would have certainly held a meeting with Mary McLeod. Well, do you remember or do you not?
Oh, we certainly held, well, as I said earlier, she was at our monthly meetings. We often met with her, or Jamie did, virtually weekly. So the reality would be those issues would be raised with her, and we would be seeking answers to, and we ended up doing walk rounds and everything to be able to confirm the priority in order to address this particular issue with HEPA filters. And the rest of forgive my previous conversations, senile moment, if you want to call it that, for taps, but without, you'll come on to them later. So my understanding is, yes, as soon as anything was raised with us, we would be looking to get and obtain answers, because that's my responsibility, as is Jamie's and others within the organisation. This is going to affect significantly our patient groups, or could affect them significantly. Well, and if it's a requirement, it should have been in place. Hence my earlier conversations about validation.
Well, you explain on page 15 that you would have spoken to Mary McLeod, and you go on to say that you would also have raised it with David Loudon, who was then the project leader. I'm just trying to understand the way somebody in your position approached this, Mr. Hill, because if you think about it, it potentially raises three questions. One, why are there not HEPA filters? Two, who signed this off without HEPA filters? I.e., how can you have validated it if there's no HEPA filters? And three, does this suggest there are other issues potentially in this area which is going to receive vulnerable people? Now, I didn't find in your answer, and it may be my fault, any indication that you had a good old think about this and pursued it. Is that
Well, I would
fair?
imagine. I can only comment on the fact that what I can recall, and a lot of it doesn't ring any bells with me, so I can't make any comment on it. But I can reassure at the time, any issues that were raised, David Loudon and others, including the fact that David would be sitting around the directors' table when we met as directors for the entire organisation, that those conversations would definitely have taken place. That would have been a telephone call to David in the first instance. The meeting with Mary would be for what are we going to do about it in terms of the situation. And the reality was there were lots of conversations taking place about the organisation's building and various issues about it that I was never party to. And I've got no clarity about, I know they talked about water issues. I know they talked about ventilation. They maybe had other issues, BMT in the adult sector, for example. But the reality is, I wasn't party to all those discussions. It depended on whether they took place behind a private door or within a committee meeting that I happened to be party of. And there'd be a variety of that.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this, and I just need to get your take on it. You were head of women and children. The Shihallian unit was something that you were, if you ignore the chief operating officer and chief executive, you were the top person responsible for.
Yes.
Was it not your job to find out what had happened, why it had happened, how on earth these things had taken place? Did it indicate any other issues? Was that not something that was part of your role?
Yes.
And did you do that?
Well, I can't hand on heart. I would have asked questions, as I normally would in that role and any other role I've been in, about what are the consequences of this? How did we manage to commission this part of the organisation without these in place? If they were part of the specification. But I'd never seen a specification. I've never seen a clinical outcome document related to the new build. I don't know what paperwork existed. Therefore, as much as I can challenge people, I've also got to trust them as the experts. I'm talking now about the engineering and various people that come in to build the building and commission ventilation. Yes, perhaps I should have pursued that in a bigger, wider area, but I didn't.
Mr. Hill, I noted you as saying, I got no clarity. Now, just to understand what you meant, what you meant by that, were you looking for clarity that was denied to you, or maybe you were meaning something else?
I think the situation is that there are a number of people with responsibilities in Greater Glasgow and Clyde. What they choose to share with you and at what level is obviously a personal issue. I am unaware people were withholding anything from me. I am not accusing anybody of anything. All I'm trying to repeat is, and reflect on, is honestly what I recall.
Right, thank you.
I'm simply trying to we're creating a jigsaw puzzle here, Mr. Hill, from recollections of things that are a long time ago. So apologies for that. But I suppose what I'm trying to get at is you're somebody who is assuming that what you're going to get in the Shihallian unit is going to be at least as good, possibly better, than they had at York Hill in terms of all the facilities, ventilation and everything else. Did you get any assurance from anyone at the time, it's 2015, that that's what you'd been given? Or did it not get that far?
No.
Do you remember whether you asked?
No.
Now, is that you don't, sorry, this is my fault. Is that you don't remember, or is that you didn't ask?
I don't recall asking.
Thank you. Well, we'll move on, Mr. Hill, deal with one or two other things. You're asked about isolation rooms, and you say in your answer on page 16, you were made aware of an issue, the rooms were unsuitable, and then a discussion ensued as to how to deal with it. Is that correct?
Yes.
But you weren't aware in advance that there was going to be an unsuitable provision. That was not something you were involved in.
No.
Okay, let me just move on then to some other issues. Page 17, we turn to the topic of water now. I accept that you're an administrator, you're not a water engineer, so we'll take it we're bearing that in mind. We're asking everybody about the DMA Canyon report of 2015 and when they knew about it. I can dig it out if we need to, but I think you know what I'm talking about here. Now, you say on page 17, you weren't aware of it in 2015 or 2016, and you became aware of reference to it during 2018. Can you remember at all when in 2018 or not?
I think I was in attendance at a directors meeting with the chief executive, and there certainly was reference to there'd been some rumours going round that there'd been a report done, and it was mentioned at a meeting I was at. I remember them by reference to the DMA. I knew nothing about a DMA report and knew nothing about its contents, etc. It became appropriate at that stage and indicated it was to do with the testing of water quality.
So you're just so I'm clear, you're at a board meeting.
No, I'm at an acute directors meeting, which is
acute directors
not
meeting.
board. Yeah.
My apologies. An acute directors meeting, but prior to that meeting, as you put it, rumours had been circulating that there was some report. What report? A report that hadn't been actioned, a report that was missing. Can you help us at all?
I understood it was a report. I understood it was a report that had been published, had been received by the board or by the Director of Estates and Facilities, that there were a number of recommendations within that report, and that my recollection is a number were either outstanding or it had not been addressed in its entirety.
Were you involved in any further discussion of the DMA Canyon report, or is that not something that really crossed your desk?
No, I wasn't involved in it, but I knew meetings were taking place about it. But again, that's back to meetings that I wouldn't have necessarily been invited to anyway.
Okay. Well, let me just ask you about TAPS, since you volunteered some material on that, as you put it earlier. We've been talking about things called Horn Optotherm TAPS, which became an issue because there'd been a report from Northern Ireland of neonatal deaths associated with flow straighteners, and these taps had something that was equivalent to a flow straightener in them. And if I'm not getting the technicalities correct, you'll forgive me. Now, do you remember being involved in discussions about the Horn taps or not?
Not specifically about the design of the tap or otherwise, but I do recall conversations taking place between General Manager and our estates colleagues about the design of the taps that were in place, and the solution was to replace them in a phased way, as I think I referred to earlier, across a number of clinical areas. to ensure that we weren't heightening the chance of infections amongst the patient groups.
But in 2014, so this is still when the hospital is being built, the information we have is it was a discussion which centered around the fact that many of the taps had already been installed or ordered or supplied. And the question was, do we have to take them all out again and do something different, or do we just press on? In your witness statement at page 18, you say the advice of IPC would have been sought to determine the safest outcome for patients. Is that what you would have expected to happen?
Yes, definitely.
Were you aware that the decision was taken to press on and use horn taps, but to create a maintenance regime designed to reduce the biofilm issues? Were you aware of that at all?
No.
Because I think some parties to the inquiry might suggest it was a decision which was driven by the financial consequences of not, of ripping stuff out and starting again. You're not involved in these discussions?
No.
Can I ask you a sort of almost an administrative question, which appears also on page 18? You're asked about how did you get involved in some of the water contamination discussions? And you say your involvement in potential water contamination issues as a direct source of infections in patients in Shihallian was as a member of an IMT. Now, I have two questions about that. You're by qualification an administrator, and you're a very senior administrator for most purposes in NHS GGC. What are you doing at an IMT?
Because given the seriousness of what had, if you think about the events that had taken place since we, if you like, physically moved into the hospital, it was regarded as very important that at senior level, first of all, I was paying attention to what's going on, and secondly, I was reporting back through to the chief executive entirely about what was happening, and clearly what are we doing about it. Given the entirety of the sensitivities that were clearly apparent and the risks to patients, that's why I was there.
Right. Perhaps you could answer me another general question. If we go to page 20 of your witness statement.
Could I just return to that?
Yes.
When you're talking about attendance, or when Mr. Connell was talking about attendance at IMTs, I take it that was in 2018, or have I got the timescale correct?
Yes.
Now, if we look at the minutes of the IMTs from March of 2018, would we expect to see you as one of the attendees at the IMTs, or alternatively, Mr. Redfern as your manager?
Well, Mr. Redfern would normally be in attendance, and if he was, sometimes I would not be able to attend depending on my other conflicting areas to be responsible for and what was happening. But wherever possible, if Jamie couldn't attend, I would attend on his behalf. So we kind of, if you like, made sure that either Jamie or myself were at the meeting. And that's the way we kind of managed it as we moved forward. I wouldn't be at every IMT, and Jamie would probably be at most of them. That was the way it worked.
And that would reflect your understanding at that time of the seriousness of the concerns over water contamination. Have I got that right?
Correct.
Thank you.
And you express your view on that, I think, at the foot of page 18 and running on to 19, and we needn't get you to read that out. I wanted to ask you another general question that we've struggled with a little bit, and maybe you can or cannot help us. If you go to page 20 of your witness statement, we're talking about the decant of patients from 2A and B. Quite a big thing in itself. But this is being discussed in 2018. Now, we've heard that concerns about, particularly the ventilation, never mind the water, in the Shihallian unit started in 2015. Is it not fair to say that by the time you come to 2018, it was reasonably well known that the ventilation system wasn't what it ought to have been?
That's not my understanding. My understanding was that whatever was required to improve the ventilation system had been undertaken. I know we were doing, tests were being carried out in terms of the positive, negative aspects, the isolation and the readings within the rooms and the readings in the environment outside. So, and our infection control colleagues were also part of that reporting back. So I am not aware that we were continually talking about ventilation since 2015.
No, I think we know from other sources that in 2018 some formal reports were prepared which indicated that 2A had not been built in the way that had been anticipated. If I just use that as a neutral way of putting it for the moment, in terms of air change rates and protective environment and so on. But there's also been a number of witnesses who've said, well, yeah, that's when we got the formal reports, but it was pretty well known before that the environment was not what should have been the York Hill Plus equivalent that you've spoken of. Were you not aware of that? No?
Well, I don't recall us forever talking about air ventilation systems, and I do recall the fact that it was flagged early on in 2015. We were treating patients in the unit, therefore there was certainly, and it was certainly a clinical environment that was deemed safe at that time to treat patients. The other thing is that standards throughout the UK, the built standards for air ventilation, I understand, in these types of units. Some units don't have them. They run on a general ward. And I'm sure Dr. Gibson refers to that in one of her statements. So, because she's one of the GC accredited visitors. So she looks at the standards as part of visiting other wards and units. So I can't comment on the fact that to be fair, in order to upgrade the ventilation system, I'm not involved in what is the requirements to do that. My understanding was the ward was deemed safe to transfer to. That was the decision we took at the time.
I suppose that the question some might want answered, Mr. Hill, is that we know reports in or around 2018 said lots of things were wrong with the ventilation system of 2A, and when we know ultimately it was stripped out and replaced. I think the question is, why did it take from 2015, when the first signs of concern arose, until 2018 for this to be done? Can you help us at all on that, or is it not your area?
I don't know. I mean, I think there were a lot of investigations. People were visiting every 6 months. Reports were being prepared. I can't explain why it's taken 3 years to get to that point. It's not my direct area of responsibility, but the clinical area is my area of responsibility.
And you were involved in the decision to decant, is that right?
Yes, yes.
And you've set out fairly fully what some of the issues were. Again, some people have said, well, if there's a problem with the water, it's the same water in 6A. Is it not? What's the benefit of moving there? Do you remember that discussion?
Yes, and the reality was that the 6A cohort of patients were not the immunocompromised patients. The immunocompromised patients moved into the ward area 4B, which was the current adult bone marrow transplant area.
When when you say not immunocompromised, you mean not in receipt of bone marrow transfer treatment?
Correct.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I'm conscious of the time. This might be the appropriate point.
Very well. Mr. Hill, as I said, we usually take a coffee break. Can I ask you to be ready to resume at what I take to be 10 to 1 your time and 10 to 12 our time? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Connell.
Thank you, Lord. A couple of questions that have been passed to me following your recent answers about the decant, Mr. Hill. When I suggested that moving into 6A wasn't necessarily a cure for the water issues because it was the same water supply, you said, oh yes, but the BMT patients are going into 4B. Is that not also using the same water?
Yes.
The other question I have really relates to this issue, which we're approaching with hindsight, and I accept that from a start in 2015, when issues started to be raised about the environment, the protective environment in 2A, to 2018, when various reports were produced which demonstrated that it hadn't been built as had been hoped for. Were you not aware that at least by 2017, at the management level, it was known that the kind of York Hill Plus specification hadn't been built?
I don't clearly recall.
But the other question, I'm probably turning the clock back a little bit, is remember we discussed validation and what it did, what it was intended to do. If you had a specialist ward with specialist ventilation requirements that you, the client, were expecting to be York Hill Plus, that's my phrase, not anyone else's, validation would tell you whether you'd achieved that, wouldn't it?
Yes.
And I just wondered whether it didn't occur to you or others that that was something that really needed to be checked because validation hadn't happened.
I was unaware at that stage that validation to what would have been, well, come back a minute. I suppose first thing is, what specification was it built to? And secondly, the expectation was, the assumption was, those are my phrases, that it would have been built to the same standard, if not higher, as a described query York Hill Plus, as you've referred to. I was unaware at that stage, and as clearly time went on, and in the hindsight, I now understand that that wasn't the case. In fact, it was far from it. It was really built to a standard ward, a general standard ward. Therefore, of course, I'm concerned on hearing that, but that's in hindsight.
I wonder if at any point as matters progressed and we're heading into 2017, 2018, so on, did it ever occur to you that you should engage assistance from any of the Scottish Government agencies like HFS or HPS, whatever the right name was at that time?
I have no direct route to them. That would be done through the Chief Operating Officer or the Chief Executive to engage at the next level up at the Scottish Government. Bearing in mind, my understanding would have been they would have been involved in Health Facilities Scotland, Health Protection Scotland should have been involved in I would have thought, the pre-commissioning of the building, the fact that we were building a brand new building, what were the standards we were going to build it to, because they are the owners of the standards in that regard.
Okay, well, just to come back to my question, I can understand that, in your view, triggering assistance from these agencies might have been a matter for somebody 1 or 2 pay grades above your own, but would it not have needed somebody to prod them from below, like you? Or
I suspect, oh, sorry, apologies.
No, I was just saying, someone like you or someone in your position, that kind of position, to say that all these issues arising, we need some external help.
I suppose in hindsight, my failing, if any, would have been that I did not ask to see a validation report. I should have done in hindsight. I did not see any paperwork that confirmed the standard of what was actually put in place. I mean, ventilation, taps, whatever failings were further and eventually discovered. So I, in hindsight, accept and I'm saddened that I didn't do any of that. It's certainly a lesson, not that I'm going to be working any further, but it's certainly a lesson to be learned by not just me, but any fellow manager who's currently managing and the organisations as they go forward. As I said earlier, I was astonished to understand that that first of all, the commissioning process did not meet whatever specification was described. I don't even know what the specification was for those ward areas. So yes, saddened that patients were affected as a consequence of any inaction on my part.
I'm going to move to a slightly different topic. Some questions that we were asked to put to you that were put to you in time to get into your written statement. On page 22 of your witness statement, there's some exchanges near the foot of that page where you're quoted as talking about the need for a multidisciplinary team reaching a consensual position about, in this case, the decant of patients from 6A to the CDU. And I think the response to that we've been asked to put to you as well, you talk about a multidisciplinary team. Is that not what an IMT is?
Yes, it is, but it's come back to the point, it's not a decision-making body other than in the context of what is the source of infections, what is causing them, how do we think we should treat and manage them. The operational responsibility for the ward environment, ward areas, etc., the operational responsibility for that rests with the clinical and managerial team. So if you like, the select group of individuals who were asked to meet were charged with, through IMT, trying to find a alternative location, a safe alternative location, despite the concerns and issues that were rife throughout the adult SOAP, children's hospital with regard to water, filtration, etc. And that's what we endeavoured to do, and I'm pleased to say we were able to reach that conclusion. That's not to say everyone agreed with the final conclusion, but we had to reach one, given the issues and the recurring issues that were taking place on Ward 6A.
And that small group, I understand from the thrust of the questions, didn't have clinicians in it. It was managers, if you like. Is that right?
Correct. Well, there was one clinician, but that's Therese Inkster, but she's not responsible for the clinical service. She's responsible for giving us advice and recommendations to do with infection control.
Yeah. Okay. So there's sort of two-stage process then. The IMT says, this is what we're proposing you do, and then a separate group meets and says, and considers whether that is what will or will not happen.
Well, the IMT was talking to us about, or asking us to seek alternative locations in order to safely allow Ward 6A and the patients who were currently occupying it to be safely transferred elsewhere, given the nature of what and the extent of the water, shower, cubicles, filtration issues were. And it was deemed safer at that time. We had been doing, if you like, smaller works within that ward while we were still treating patients. But it was then deemed, in order to get to the entirety of what lay behind shower cubicles, shower coverings, etc., behind tap outlets and various other things, we would have to have dismantled parts of the wall structure, create dust, workmen and women going throughout the place. So we really had to decide it's no longer a safe place to try and do all that alongside a functioning ward.
You've also been asked a question that seems to infer, at least, that you might have disagreed with Dr. Inkster about risk from mould in shower rooms. And you say, no, you didn't disagree. That's dealt with on page 23 of your witness statement.
Yes, I don't think I just, sorry.
No, carry on, about 2/3 of the way down.
Yeah. I don't recall disagreeing with her. I don't recall it. Therefore, I think that's what I've said.
Yeah.
I was as keen as anyone to find out why we were getting the various outbreaks, the various developments in the ward environment, and clearly hence why ultimately the decision was taken to move to the clinical decisions unit in order to allow a full, thorough estates and maintenance investigation into what all the sources were and potential sources.
I see also on that page there seems to be an inference that you might have disagreed with the IMT decision to sample drains. Now, was that something you disagreed with or not?
I think I expressed the opinion that I would expect drains to have bacteria within them and organisms. Having said that, however, it was not my decision whether we tested drains or whatever. So I'm not saying, I don't have any jurisdiction over whether we were going to test drains or not. I think the debate was more to do with that we're going to find things in drains. It's the nature of any drainage system.
Now, if we move on page 24, you are asked about a decision to close Ward 6A to new admissions. Now, was that something you were involved in?
No, I wasn't involved in the decision making itself. That was a clinical decision taken between the clinicians, the ward nursing staff, and Jamie as, if you like, the general manager in charge of that area. And their decision was to avoid admitting anyone new patients into the hospital during this period of time. That was a decision that was supported by me, and therefore that's what we implemented.
Yeah, I think that the narrative that you inserted on page 24 running on to 25 suggests that it wasn't perhaps quite as simple as just saying no new admissions because some people were not happy with the alternatives. Is that something you were involved with or something you were simply told about by others?
No, I was aware of that, and we were aware of that as part of the discussion about trying to avoid taking any new admissions. It was the decision whether to admit a new patient or otherwise was the clinician's decision. If they then said they were admitting them, we had to make whatever workarounds we had to do. We had to cater for that and be able to respond to that appropriately. If they decided to refer them elsewhere, which they did on a handful of patients, is my understanding, most of those patients who were referred elsewhere didn't like where they were transferred to. They also didn't think the standards across there were any, well, they didn't think the environment across there was any better than the one they were leaving.
Another thing I need to ask you about, well, you've actually been asked in your witness statement, but I just want to come there, appears on page 26, where there's a discussion about an IMT on the 18th of January 2019, where Dr. Inkster, from her statement, says that she felt she was being pressurized, possibly bullied even, at that time. Now, I think this is a meeting you were there. Can we just make sure we understand what your position is on that suggestion that she was being put under pressure?
Well, I think I said in my statement, I appreciate having to chair a meeting and also report into that meeting, given the detailed information that Dr. Inkster used to have to share with us, is obviously a very difficult position to be in. And I respect her for trying to do both tasks at the same time. Secondly, I might not agree with Dr. Inkster in terms of her approach, but I cannot argue against the facts and figures and various details she shares with the committee, and I'm not in a qualified position to do so. So I take her advice on board, just like other members of that group. I'm not aware that I would ever put her under pressure. I was very supportive, I thought. That's my usual approach in a meeting where I'm a participant or whether I'm chairing. I'm looking for people to participate. I'm looking to support the chair because it's a difficult role. And also, I find it difficult to recollect how I could put her under pressure or additional stress. So I don't recall anything different with that meeting than I do with some others. I could certainly have asked some questions and would be directing my questioning, but that's part of my role and that's part of the way I have operated throughout my career. But I'm certainly not treating people with disrespect, and I'm certainly not trying to humiliate them in public.
Yeah, in your answer, in your witness statement on page 26, you say you suspect you'd have asked questions and challenged points. Were you in a position to challenge what Dr. Inkster would be saying?
No, not in a position to challenge her from a technical and professional point of view. But if some of the statements were about we need to now move out the ward or we now need to do this, some of those points were challengeable and were rightly challengeable because we needed to discuss it to understand fully, because the consequences of moving from this ward had to be addressed properly if we were going to move. I mean, at one time people were talking about closing the ward down. So if you're talking about closing the ward down, I'm going to challenge that, because that means there's nowhere else in Scotland that these patients can go. There's not an equivalent unit in Scotland. There's a equivalent lesser unit, as I think I've indicated elsewhere, in Edinburgh. It couldn't have dealt with the entirety of patients in the first instance. So we've got to work on the basis that we are operationally responsible for trying to maintain a service, yes, but also taking into account professional advice, facts and figures in order to make that as safe as possible for the patient groups we're dealing with. But I don't recall directly challenging Dr. Inkster about, I mean, my general point is if somebody says, for example, I can give you one quote. We were originally told at one time that the infection that was arising was only discovered previously on Mars on the spaceship, right? That was a quote from somebody at a meeting, an IMT meeting. At that point, of course, me, like any other, would say, well, if it's only been discovered there, how come we're now dealing with it on Earth? So there's been some ridiculous comments made, I would say, in my opinion, which clearly needed to be, if you like, challenged and therefore not entertained any further.
Yeah, I suspect you're referring to, and I've probably forgotten the full name now, an organism called Elizabeth Kingia. Yeah. And then there's a second part to that, which is said to have been discovered in the space station. First recorded in the space station. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Can I ask you to have a look at bundle 8, please? Page 85. Now, this is a letter in September 19 to a band of consultants who've raised concerns. I see your name appears. Was this an uncomfortable time for you to have consultants coming together to say they're not happy?
No, I think it's important that consultants tell us when they're not happy.
And were you involved in the process of speaking to them?
Yes.
What form did that take? Did you meet them individually, or was it in a bigger meeting?
Yeah, I used to attend they had a weekly meeting. From what I understand, they would sometimes have a bigger monthly meeting. Jamie would always probably be present there, but occasionally I would be invited to come and meet them and catch up with them, and I would do that. And that would be quite a normal situation for us. That gave the consultants a chance to ask us any questions, what was going on elsewhere on the board and whatever, and etc. But clearly, there are concerns here were raised, and legitimately and rightly they were responded to, as in the form of a meeting.
Do you think you were able to reassure them that their concerns were not well founded?
I don't think we were trying to reassure them that at all. They clearly had concerns, and they were right to raise those concerns, and they sought answers, whether we were able to provide the answers there and then, or whether we went away to do other pieces of work. And clearly it was part of the ongoing issues which resulted subsequently in the moves of Ward towards 6A into the CDU, and to the ultimate upgrading of 2A and 2B in the new Children's Hospital.
Thank you. I just want to ask you about one or two places where you've used particular language. We can go back to the witness statement and go to page 27. We're talking there about Cryptococcus, and I don't really want to ask you very much about that subject, but I wanted to ask you about a communications point that appears at the foot of the page. You say, if the source of infection was unknown, then the statement could not include speculative or multiple reasons without conclusive evidence. Is that your understanding, that you need conclusive evidence before you can explain this to patients and parents?
No, but you need to be clear that any communication about Cryptococcus or an infection would be led by, and I would seek, as the board did, and the communications team did, Dr. Inkster, who was lead for this area at that time, her wording in order to ensure anything we were going to say was factually correct and was, if you like, could be challenged in an evidence-based way. So it's not for me to talk about the source of infections, given the fact at that stage we had multiple sources, potential sources of infection. We were, if you like, trying to address those on every occasion when they arose, and did do.
Yeah, but my question is really focused on the word conclusive, because we've had some debate about this. The indications from other witnesses are that in the context of many infections, however many investigations you do, however quickly you move and so on, you may never ultimately know exactly what the source is, but you're able to make an assessment based on the material available to you that it was probably X or probably Y. Now,
Yes.
I just wondered why you were looking for something that was conclusive, because that might involve a slightly higher standard.
Yeah, well, in hindsight, I suppose what you're saying to me, and you're right, a lot of infections, I've been dealt with them out with Greater Glasgow and Clyde in my previous role. We would have infection in intensive care units and theatres, etc. And very often, as you've rightly said, the source came from X, but we're not sure how it entered, and we're not sure, the infection occurred in an X area, but we're unsure where the source came from. So perhaps my use of that word is erroneous in this instance. I agree with you.
Now, I'm jumping back again. You remember we were talking about investigating drains.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that you instructed was to try to find out what other hospitals did about drain sampling.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think that what lies behind the question that's been put to you is probably that someone says, well, if there's gunk coming out of the drains here, what does it matter what hospital A, B, or C does? Should we not be focusing on what we've got here? Why did you think it was appropriate to go to particularly the English picture?
Well, two things. One is we were still investigating the gunk, as you describe it, that was coming out of the drains in our hospital facilities, and we would continue, no doubt, to carry on doing that. The issue with people can test for a whole load of things, and eventually they might find it. So there's an issue about how much testing are people doing to find A, B, C, or D organisms. It was more in the context of that. Is there any kind of standard approach throughout England? And as I understand it later on, I think Health Facility Scotland or Health Protection Scotland may have been, ended up getting some kind of indicator of what was going on. But we were never able to conclude, we didn't conclude that piece of work at that stage. But it was to try and work out the range of testing that people were doing in these kind of clinical areas and how did they respond to what they found. But that answer, or the answers, if it was ever completely answered, came back later, as is referred to, I think, in other IMT minutes.
I need, unfortunately, to turn to another area where I've been asked to put a number of questions to you, and that's about communications around Professor Kadihi and who was to say what or who was not to say what to Professor Kadihi. And I think you know from your witness statement that you're going to be asked about that. Now, if we go to page 30, we see that the narrative starts by referring to Dr. Inkster's statement, and Dr. Inkster saying that she's made aware of a conversation between you and Jamie Redfern during which you instructed that that's neither Inkster nor Redfern, were to contact Professor Kadihi in relation to the issue of Mycobacterium shilloni, and you asked for your recollection. Now, my understanding, and I'd like you to correct me if it doesn't match yours, was that the question here was that an undertaking had been given to the professor to tell him if there was another case of this relatively rare organism in the hospital. And that's what this communication issue was about. Is that correct?
Don't know. I was never aware of that. First point about an undertaking.
Well, the way you respond to the question on page 31 is, I think, if I'm reading it correctly, to complain that Mr. Redfern has breached confidentiality with you. Is that your position?
No, he hadn't breached confidentiality with me. He would have breached confidentiality on behalf of the other patient and parents whose child had the same infection as Professor Kadihi's doctor.
Well, am I not right in thinking that you do accept that you told him not to contact Professor Kadihi?
I am completely clear on that. Yes, I told him not to contact and talk about another patient's condition.
Well, in your witness statement at page 31, you say the content of a private telephone conversation between Mr. Redfern and myself was made known to Dr. Inkster by the recipient. Well, that's Mr. Redfern. And you say that this was a breach of confidentiality. So that's your complaint, isn't it?
Well, my complaint is that clearly if I give Jamie Redfern an instruction and in order to, I suppose, I just have to wonder why he needs to tell someone else why I said you can't meet to have a conversation about a patient that's going to breach confidentiality. I mean, he could easily have said he obviously chose to make it that I told him and instructed him, which is fine. I defended that in terms of and justified it in terms of my statement. That's what happened. I know that he obviously breached my confidentiality in having that conversation, but the point was I only got to know that when I read Theresa Inkster's statement.
So can you help us to understand what you say in the next sentence? You'd suspected Mr. Redfern was briefing and speculating with Dr. Inkster and Professor Kadihi throughout this period. what is it you're suggesting that Mr. Redfern was up to?
No, I'm just referring to the fact that Mr. Redfern is a very kind and generous man. I've worked well with him throughout the years I was there, and we got on very well. What I'm saying is, Jamie's natural reaction to a confrontational type discussion or a challenging issue would be to try and appease the other side. Now, that's not to say he's not wrong in that, but the reality is when it comes to a general manager's responsibility to be able to defend and uphold patient confidentiality, you can't have a discussion about other patients and parents, first of all, without their consent. And secondly, you need to decide whether, because let's be fair, a singular individual patient can easily be identified, even if you call them patient X in this instance. The cohort of these patients is too small to be able to have a general conversation and keep the identity, if you like, hidden. So my point is that, as far as I'm concerned, my discussion with Jamie Redfern was a private conversation. It's been breached. He's told someone else. That was my point.
Well, let me do. I've been asked to put some follow-up questions to you on that basis. And I'll just use the wording I've been given. You instructed Jamie Redfern not to contact Professor Kadihi, well, that's clear. You say it was a direct result of the Chief Executive and Chairman informed me they'd received a letter from Professor Kadihi and they would be responding to it. Mm-hmm. You also seem to indicate in your answer, and we can see that in what you've just told us orally and also in what you say here, that you were concerned Mr. Redfern would breach confidentiality in his conversation with Professor Kadihi by revealing information about the second child. Can I ask you this, was there any involvement in this instruction that you issued to Mr. Redfern from Ms. Grant or Mr. Best?
Yes, I had an instruction from the Chief Executive and the Chairman to not get involved in the conversation with Professor Kadihi, including any of my direct reports. I was unaware of the content in the letter, as I think I've indicated in my statement to them, the letter to them.
So, well, let's try and understand this. If there hadn't been the risk of a breach of confidentiality, would you have been content for Mr. Redfern to discuss matters with Professor Kadihi?
No, because my instruction from the Chief Executive was that the Chairman will deal with this inquiry. We've received a letter, which I had never seen at that stage, and we are going to deal with that. So therefore, I would have, separately, if Jamie had come to me and said him and Dr. Inkster were going to speak to Dr. Kadihi about a second case, then given he never ever told me they'd made an undertaking, so I was never aware of that undertaking, and therefore, if you like, guarantee to Professor Kadihi, I was unaware of that until you've raised it now and through my previous reading. Therefore, the reality is, I would have told them the same thing. Patient confidentiality is the number one rule in hospital management.
Were you aware that Dr. Inkster had been involved with Professor Gibson in a duty of candour conversation with the family of the 2019 Mycobacterium chelonae case?
Don't know.
Were you aware that Dr. Inkster would have been a party to any conversation with Jamie Redfern was going to have with Professor Kadihi?
I would have assumed he was going to meet Professor Kadihi in the presence of Dr. Inkster. That was the way Jamie normally operated, or he would have met Professor Kadihi in the presence of Dr. Gibson or whoever the treating consultant was at that time for his daughter. Jamie Redfern, sorry.
No, carry on. Tell me what you're going to say.
I was just going to advise, Jamie Redfern, like myself, has no clinical background. He has experience, just like I have, of running, operating and managing clinical services throughout decades, etc. But the reality is we are not qualified clinicians. So whenever there's a clinical discussion taking place, the minimum requirement is either to have the practicing clinician in there, sometimes supported by another clinician if they think a second view is required to provide some greater clarity. And the reality is no one who's a non-clinician should be having a clinical conversation with a parent, or anyone else without a clinician being present.
Well, the follow-up question that comes inevitably from that is, you'd be aware that Dr. Inkster was a very experienced practitioner. Would you be aware that she's obviously regulated by her regulator, the GMC, and she would also be aware, would she not, that revealing details of a case of another family is a serious matter? She would be aware of all of that.
Yes, she would.
So is it your position that a conversation involving Professor Kadihi, Dr. Inkster and Mr. Redfern created a risk of breach of confidentiality?
Yes, because they were going to declare, well, breach of confidentiality on the basis that has the second case patient and parents aware that their case is going to be discussed and shared with a third party? I don't know the answers to that, but those are the questions that clearly I would oppose to Jamie, because you can't have that conversation, and that's why I described to him, you're in breach of confidentiality.
Well, I suppose I'm coming back to the question, whatever the conversation was going to be, if it involved Inkster, Redfern and Kadihi, I'm just keen to know whether you thought there was a real risk of some breach of confidentiality in that exchange.
Well, by the very nature of duty of candour, unless the patient who you're going to talk about, i.e. case number 2, if I describe them as that, along with the parents, given the age of the child, they need to consent to information being shared about their child. If they do not do that and are not approached to do that, it therefore becomes a breach of confidentiality. And
you're suggesting that might have happened?
If the meeting had went ahead without those previous explanations and guarantees that the family were happy to proceed on that basis. But I got no reassurance from Jamie that the second family knew about the conversation, because he didn't tell me. I asked him whether the family were going to be approached. He couldn't tell me. Therefore, the reality is it was definitely a breach of confidentiality, in my opinion, if that conversation had taken place without the knowledge and consent of the patient and parents concerned.
Yeah, if we carry on page 31, at the IMT on the 3rd of July 2019, you reported John Brown was in contact with Professor Kadihi, and then it was followed up at a later one when apparently you said he'd been in touch and the thing's finished. Your response to that is what? That what you said was what you were told to say by the chairman?
So my understanding is I was told at the time when I was instructed that Jamie was not going to talk to a Professor Kadihi about a second patient, was the fact that Mr. Brown was going to deal with it directly. Excuse me, I'm unaware of that, as I said, at that stage of the content of the letter and what it raised. My understanding was I was waiting for confirmation to be able to report back to IMT that that conversation had taken place, or an exchange of letters had taken place, and whatever form they took. They may have taken both. And the reality is, once that was concluded, I would report back. I wasn't, I'm not trying to make an issue of that particular communication. All I'm saying is that's what I was instructed to do.
We know that the chairman wrote to Professor Kadihi on the 4th of July 2019. We needn't dig it up just now, but for the record, it's bundle 6, document 18, page 53. Were you involved in the preparation of that letter?
I don't recall.
Because apparently the one thing it doesn't do is refer to the infection or give any explanation about that. Do you know why that is?
No.
Sorry, Mr. Connell, could you give me that bundle reference again?
Bundle 6, document 18, page 53.
Thank you.
Mr. Redfern's given some evidence around this. I think he was on holiday for a bit and then he came back. And he explained what he says you said to him. So can I just ask you about this?
Mm-hmm.
At some point, and this is, I don't have an exact date, between the 4th and the 17th of July 2019, did you tell Mr. Redfern that the matter was sorted?
Don't recall. It's not a word I would normally use.
That's apparently what Mr. Redfern recalls you said to him. Wouldn't know what you had in mind if that did represent an accurate note.
Well, depending on the date of the letter from the chairman to Professor Kadihi, if I was referring to anything and if I'd seen sight of it, I think I may have been copied in it eventually or got a copy of it. The reality is that I certainly wouldn't have said, oh, it's sorted. I would just have said it's been dealt with or it's been addressed. Those would be my types of expressions.
The other thing that Mr. Redfern says you said to him was that it had been dealt with corporately. Do you remember saying that?
Yes.
And
I probably would have used those words, yes.
And what did you mean to convey by that statement?
Well, I would have explained it to him that in actual fact, the chairman had received the letter along with the chief executive and they have responded. Therefore, it's been dealt with corporately. That's the corporate part of the organisation.
Did you have any understanding at that point as to whether an explanation had been tendered about another case of Mycobacterium shilloni or not?
No.
Do you know why there was no contact with Professor Kadihi between the IMTs on the 26th of June and the 3rd of July? Because at least some people thought they ought to have been contacted at that stage.
No, no idea. Who did he think was going to? I'm not aware. He was expecting me to contact him. I've no idea why.
Now, there's a later letter from the chief executive to Professor Kadihi on the 27th of September 2019, which is the reference in bundle 6 at page 75. Can I ask you, did you have any involvement in drafting that letter? Do you want to have a look at it?
Possible, yes, please.
Yes. Can we have bundle 6, page 75, please? Let's just go. Can we just go on to 76 just to double check there's no other text? Yeah, okay, there's limited amount of text. Having seen this, albeit fairly briefly, go back to 75, please. Do you remember whether you had any involvement in its preparation?
I don't recall having any involvement in the final wording, but clearly I was always briefing the chief executive, given the heightened issues that were going on, as I say, within my area of responsibility. So some of those words may reflect some of the things I've told her previously, etc. But I didn't prepare the letter. I was not involved in the draft or redrafting the letter, from my recollection.
Now, I'm told, and we can check if we need to, that the IMT's view was that the duty of candour required some kind of communication with the Kadihis about this Mycobacterium shilloni. Do you know where the explanation for the delay in providing an explanation came from? In here it said to be waiting for typing results.
No, but then that would be a laboratory issue if they were waiting for typing results, and I'm not blaming them. I'm saying that sometimes these results take a while, depending what you're trying to grow, what you're trying to, if you like, disaggregate from any growth in a tube or in a whatever the wee tablet thing's called. Forgive me. So, no, I don't.
So that's not something that came from you. That must have been obtained from somewhere else.
Correct.
Do you think waiting for typing results is a good reason to delay the communication?
Well, well, it's not me who's written the letter, and I'm not responding to it. So the letter says the position as was the case from Jane Grant at that particular time. If it's to do with the fact that typing results take longer, then perhaps it could have been phrased differently, but I'm not aware of the detail, and I wasn't involved in the detail of it.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about was that the inference from some of the things you said earlier today, and also some of the things you've said in your witness statement, is that one of the drivers for Professor Kadihi not hearing from others, as it were, was to avoid cutting across the chairman's communications. Do you know why that's not mentioned in this letter?
No.
With the benefit of hindsight, would you describe the communications with the Kadihi family at this time as transparent?
Well, I'm not aware of what all those conversations were, so I can only work on the basis that I knew that Theresa Inkster, the clinician concerned, but mainly Theresa Inkster and Jamie Redfern, were meeting with Professor Kadihi from very early on in his daughter's admission. And particularly given the increased situation affecting his daughter, then clearly that communication became more regular. I appreciate your reference to earlier. Jamie was away on vacation. He usually did take the first 2 weeks in July off, so that would be the case. If Professor Kadihi expected somebody to communicate with him during that time, I certainly wasn't aware that, because Jamie could have briefed me and said, would you be in touch with Professor Kadihi or whatever? And I'm sure I would have done that, etc. But the reality was I'm unaware of all of that. And therefore, Professor Kadihi received communication about his daughter on a daily basis from the practicing clinician, etc., including no doubt Dr. Inkster when she accompanied them on ward rounds. If it's other types of communication not affecting his daughter or potentially affecting his daughter, then I wasn't aware he was expecting some updates or regular feedback.
Well, from your experience, can you suggest any lessons that might be learned from what happened here? Because clearly Professor Kadihi wasn't very pleased with the way the communications went.
Well, in terms of regular communication and updates, it would have depended on did I, and I don't think I did, which is why we didn't do anything, was that, you know, if Mr. Redfern's dealing with Professor Kadihi and says he will report back in a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, then unless he describes that to someone else and passes it across and that other receiving person takes responsibility for ensuring that happens, and that's been done on other occasions with different issues and matters, then that could have been handled better in the instance you're describing. At that stage, that's all I can say.
Thank you. Since I've got the advantage of having you here, I just wanted to ask you another question about communications. Another couple of questions about communications. Can we go back to your witness statement at page 33? this arises out of discussions with others, so I think I hope I'm not too oblique when I ask the question. About 2/3 of the way down your answer on page 33, you say NHS GGC attempts to robustly and timely answer all media inquiries and present a factual situation from the board's perspective. Now, about 3 lines prior to that, you say any press release would be based upon the factual situation so far as parent care was concerned. Is there a difference between the facts and the facts from the board's perspective?
No, there shouldn't be, because it's the same communication team at Greater Glasgow and Clyde that would prepare the board statements and statements on behalf of a directorate or on behalf of the chief executive. So it's the same team. They'd be using the same data and facts that were obviously available to us at that stage and to them, and the statement would be prepared accordingly.
Can I ask you another question? If we go to page 34, we're talking here about, you remember a time when, as part of the communication exercise, there was a whole list of issues framed in a whole variety of ways, some of which were repetitive, which were raised, and it was decided to put out a statement dealing with all of these. Now that's in bundle 6, document 25 at page 77. And you've had a chance to look at that, and you said you had some involvement in providing answers and reviewing drafts, and you think the answers were accurate. We're now in 2019, late on in 2019. By that time, the board has had the Decant, it's had reports from experts on the state of the ventilation in Ward 2A and so on, from which it must have been plain, would it not, that, at least so far as the board's concerned, what was built so far as ventilation and the like in Ward 2A was not what it ought to have been. Now, I think the general criticism that's been made, and I'd like your view on it, is that that's the one thing that the board didn't say. They didn't say, we're very sorry, this ward should have been built differently. We've got lots of material to show it wasn't. That's why we're spending lots of money fixing it. They said they're spending lots of money fixing it, but they don't say it wasn't built correctly in the first place. Now,
I've never heard anyone. Sorry, carry on.
So I was wondering what your view on that point is.
I've never heard anyone throughout the time I was in Greater Glasgow and Clyde saying it was not built appropriately, despite the findings.
Were you not aware of investigations carried out on behalf of the board into the specification of Ward 2A against SHTM 0301, air change rates? Because I think you said earlier, did you not, that it had been built just as a standard ward?
Well, that is my understanding in hindsight, having read all the paperwork that I received as part of preparing my statement.
Were you not aware of that at the time, at least by 2018? No?
I would have known some bits of it, but not the entire picture.
Sorry, Mark.
Mr. Connell, I wonder perhaps we might have missed quite what Mr. Hill was saying. Mr. Hill, I noticed you were saying, I have never heard anyone saying that the building was not built as, and then my note runs out. And then you said, despite, and I think the investigations. Now, what I took from your answer, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, is that you never heard an admission or a statement, or however one wants to describe it, to the effect that the building had not been built as required. And then you contrasted that with what had been revealed by investigation. I'm just concerned that I wasn't quite sure if Mr. Connell had picked up, as it were, the weight of your answer. So I've gone on for some time. Maybe just give you a chance to state it as you would wish to state it.
Well, thank you. As I said, and I'll repeat that part, I have never known anyone admit to the building not being built to, well, so let me just put a precursor in here. The specification that the building was built to, I'm not aware of the contents again, specifically Ward 2A, 2B. Excuse me. Therefore, it is very difficult to say the building may have been built to the standards that they commissioned from the builder. And the technical ventilation could have been built and installed to the standards that were in the specification. I am unaware of whether there was an additional specification requirement for this particular ward that enabled the builder to be held accountable, if you like, because they'd made an error in only putting a standard system in. Therefore, what I'm saying is that no one's ever admitted to me or anyone else that I'm aware of in my time during employment of Greater Glasgow and Clyde that there was an error made, because the builder might have built it to specification. But what might have happened is, at that stage, the additional specifications that should have been included in operating theatres, intensive care units, the adult BMT wards, the children's BMT area wards, were never included anyway. So the builder built what the client specified, but that wasn't appropriate enough given the patient cohorts that were going to occupy certain parts of the building. Is that clearer?
I'm not suggesting what you said originally was not clear. I just wondered if we had picked it up correctly. So what I'm taking from that is that you've never heard any expression of admission that the building was not built as it should have been. Now, as I say, Mr. Connell, my apologies if I'm just confusing matters, but I just wondered if that was the weight of your, or rather whether you and Mr. Hill were exactly on the same page.
Well, we're possibly slightly at cross purposes. I'll try again. Leave aside, because we're not here to decide any disputes between the board and the contractors. That's not part of our job at all. So we're not really interested in anything from that angle. That's a matter for someone else to sort out. We know that you thought, and I don't think you were alone in that the ventilation requirements for the Shihallian unit should have been in accordance with guidance, SHTM 0301, and at least as good as York Hill, possibly better. So that's what you thought, and you're the head of Women and Children, you wanted. And you subsequently discovered that it had not been built in that way, because it was built as an ordinary ward.
Yeah, so first of all, when you say I wanted, it wasn't me that wanted it. We're talking about expectations. So expectations of anyone going into a brand new hospital would be, it would be built to the current standards and any other additionality that you can forecast as part of before you move patients into it.
Yeah. Well, I'm not, don't worry, I'm not seeking to lay the specification on your shoulders, Mr. Hill, at all, because others have said very similar things. The question, I think, in terms of communications is if that was the general board expectation, that's what they thought should have been provided, never mind whether it was done properly or not. Was that not known pretty clearly that you hadn't got what you hoped you would get by the time of the answers to the issues paper in 2019?
we clearly hadn't got what we expected to get for part of that building at that time, from what we'd known from infections that had occurred and from investigations that had revealed the extent of, if you like, the misalignment between what we would have regarded as a standard build for that specific area versus what we did get, which appeared to be more general.
And I think the criticism that's been made of that piece of communication is that the one thing it doesn't say is, we expected it would be X, it wasn't. It's our building. So far as you, the patients, are concerned, that's our problem. We may have an issue with someone else or not, that depends. But so far as the patients are concerned, it's our building. And would you accept that wasn't made clear?
That definitely wasn't made clear.
Now, I think I only have two things I want to ask you. And then we have a process here, Mr. Hill, whereby after I finish, we take a very short pause to see whether in the course of our exchanges, others here have some thoughts about things that should have been asked, which I have missed. So I just want to ask you a couple of things. If we can just go to page 37, there's a reference there to something called an exchange control group. Now, I think there's maybe some debate as to whose idea this was, whether it was the chief executives or Dr. Inkster. If you think it's the chief executives, it doesn't matter. But this was an idea for an additional group. Is that fair?
Yeah, and just for your reference, it was called Executive Control Group.
Executive Control
Executive Control Group. Yeah, I think you mentioned exchange, but it's
sorry, that's my fault.
Just for the record.
My fault entirely. Executive Control Group, as it says in the statement. And I've read your witness statement. Do I understand that basically this started but didn't get very far and then was wound up? Is that what happened?
Yeah, we tried to get it off the ground, bearing in mind that there were frequent meetings taking place about infection control, official IMT meetings taking place in the same weeks. This was a means of trying to get a greater understanding between the different views that were coming across between certain, particularly between the estates and facilities and my infection control colleagues and operational management from ourselves. So it was to try and get clarity around what are we trying to say and how are we going to manage the operational consequences of how we take some of those things forward. But to come back to your point, it was such a busy time. People would either commit to it at the beginning. So we got one meeting, I think, where we got full attendees. Second meeting, it didn't take place. So in other words, it was not going to be constructive. In fact, it basically impacted on people trying to do more around their daytime jobs and addressing the issues of the IMT in advance of the next IMT than it did for improving communication. Because unless you meet, you're not going to improve communication anyway. So that was it in a nutshell.
Yeah. So it might have been a good idea at the time, but it didn't work in practice.
Correct. In practice, yeah, totally.
Okay. The only other thing I wanted to do, Mr. Hill, is that we always ask contributors to the inquiry, have you anything else you want to add? And sometimes people have come up with factual things, sometimes more general. But could we go to page 39 of your witness statement? Because I think in fairness to you, in response to the question of whether you want to add anything, you have made a statement there, and I think it might be appropriate, since this is a public event, that we allow you just to take us through what you've said in that conclusion, if you wouldn't mind.
No, definitely not, and thanks for that opportunity. I suppose the first thing is, it is regrettable that patients, carers, staff and others, patients came to obviously harm or potential harm from the things that were going on in the building and in the facility and the environment. That's despite the best endeavours of our staff, our carers, our families, and working together with any other parties, including those clinicians that were out with my direct responsibility. I think it was devastating for everyone going through that at that particular time, and I know they're still going through part of that despite moving into the new upgraded facilities. But the reality is that these issues and these wounds don't take a long time to heal personally. I have expressed something, maybe not in that part of the statement, about my own, in hindsight, perhaps I should have approached this in a slightly different way, and I can only give my sincere apologies that I didn't do that as thoroughly as I may have done in the light of the knowledge I now have. But I hope others will learn from that as we go forward as part of your recommendations from the hospital inquiry. I do think that one thing I might not have referred to, if I may, would be that in future, I would always ask, so show me the ward layout, show me the specification for that ward, and show me the detailed list, not the detailed list that gets briefed to the technical person, but upon validation, what does this ward produce? Air handling, turnover, what pressures does it produce, etc. That to me would be part of a validation process that no doubt we would have learnt from in Greater Glasgow and Clyde had we had it. But clearly errors were made, or mistakes were made, or decisions were made not to include certain things in what we appeared would have been an appropriate clinical unit and facility for the types of patients, those vulnerable patients that we were meant to be and caring for, treating, and hopefully improving their care, although in some instances that's never not possible given the clinical conditions we're dealing with. And finally, all I would say is that Greater Glasgow and Clyde is a tremendous board in the sense of its scale and its people, but I do think they didn't trust individuals who were running operational areas enough to let them get on and deal with that instead of having to go through endless meetings, some of which were just repeating the weeks before's performance, and in such a time scale it's difficult to give any further progress. So all I'm saying is I've always had a criticism of how boards or organisations can operate if they don't give you the trust and freedom to actually get your staff to get aligned to do the proper jobs that they want to do. So the quality of service always comes back to how you lead the organisation. And that's all I'd conclude on. And thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hill. My lord, I have no further questions, as I indicated a moment or two ago.
Mr. Hill, thank you for that. As Mr. Connell has explained, he will want to check with colleagues in the room as to whether there's any questions that he should have asked, which have not been asked, or when I say should have asked, that might be asked. So if you could give us, I hope no more than 10 minutes, if you just stay connected, and we'll come back to you as soon as Mr. Connell has had the opportunity to have a discussion with colleagues. So.
Yes, no problem. Thank you.
I have a small number of questions which have been suggested to me. One. Mr. Hill, thank you for coming back. I've got one or two questions that I've been asked to put. They jump about a bit just by their nature. Can I first of all ask this? You remember you described a situation in which you'd become aware that Professor Gibson wasn't happy to sign off the layout of the new Shihallian unit in the new hospital. Now, given that she was the lead clinician on that unit, or whatever you want to describe her as, what was the basis on which you and others decided that, notwithstanding she wasn't going to sign it off, you would?
Well, because it was reflecting of the build that was going to be in place and was in place. So, and as you referred to your earlier comments about Dr. Gibson's early statements were to do with the ward and how it would be configured, i.e. pharmacy versus a staff room or whatever else. So those were issues that clearly we either could address once the operational situation had got underway and people in the light of practice were able to further inform that discussion. Bearing in mind, over the years, some of these ward units didn't have a pharmacy in situ, didn't have a staff room, etc. So I'm clear that those things can be addressed once we get into the building, and can, given the fact that we couldn't address some prior to that because the build was, if you like, already underway and was completed. That's what I mean by that. And therefore the plan itself reflected the layout of the ward areas that they were going to inherit on the basis of the new build being commissioned and opened and accepted.
Well, am I not right in thinking that this was all at a time when the design was still being done? The building hadn't been built at that stage. So,
yeah, but what you referred to that prior to my time in 2009 and 2010. So, and also the fact that those discussions could have been picked up and alterations could have been made, you're right, before the physical build commenced, but the specification had already been signed off. So someone somewhere has to take responsibility for going back and saying, hold on a minute, we're altering the specification. I'm sure conversations like that would have taken place. They're not unknown to have taken place in any type of build situation, but normally the answer will be the build's being built. If it's an issue, we'll address it when we get into it, given it was about accommodation, not about the, if you like, technical features at that stage of the building, because we, as we've known from the inquiry and from experience, those only came to light later on.
I think I may have touched on this with you earlier. In the period between the first concerns arising about the environment in Ward 2A in July 15, doesn't matter exactly when, and 2018 when formal reports were obtained, whose job it was it to determine ultimately that it was safe to continue operating in the existing environment, which, as you quite rightly pointed out, you subsequently discovered was not what you thought it should have been? Where did that buck stop?
Do you have a specific, sorry, my fault. Did you introduce a specific date?
Between 2015 and 2018.
Right.
Sorry, so where does the responsibility lie? Well, I suppose you will recollect, as we have from the evidence, etc., that there wasn't just one issue affecting this ward. There was multiple issues consequently, which resulted in it being transferred. Not each one of these incidents would have resulted in us ever considering transferring a ward, given the if you like, the situation and the graveness of having to transfer out of an existing clinical area, particularly being in the children's hospital. It wasn't as if we had an empty children's ward we could adapt. We were then transferring to the adult sector, as you know. Therefore, that was a very serious, but at the same time, appropriate decision to make, given the situations that were then known, the situations that we were trying to further investigate, and therefore was deemed to be with the, if you like, the consent of our adult colleagues, because they clearly had to decant to elsewhere as a consequence of that. Therefore, everyone as a corporate organisation rallied together and made that transfer possible. So come back to your point, there wasn't one issue that basically said this is now gathering up to be a completely unsafe ward. Those decisions were reached further on, is my view.
Right. So far as what was happening between 2015 and 2018, there wasn't a single decision somewhere that said, we're doing the best we can, we carry on.
Well, we were carrying on by the very nature. Sorry.
Yes, you were carrying on. I can see that. Yeah, well, let me ask you a much more technical question. Were you aware whether there was a business continuity management plan in place covering the risk of closure of a ward like 2A?
Yes.
There was one in place.
Sorry, there is one in place. Sorry, I should have said. There wasn't one at the time.
Oh, there wasn't one at the time. That's all right. Well, I misunderstood your answer. So the answer was there is one in place now, but there wasn't one in place then. Is that correct?
Or if there was one in place then, it certainly was out of date, put it that way.
Right. We've touched on the duty of candour. Can you just explain what your understanding is of the duty of candour that is incumbent on a health board?
To be open, transparent in dealing with patients and their affairs, including in the case of children with their parents. And it's about the clinical practice and the organisation, environment and everything in which their patient is being cared for. And the board, sorry.
No, carry on. Please finish your answer.
And of course, the board's responsibility is undertaken through its structure and its director, through the chief executive that it puts in place. And it's for other individuals to be able to ensure that on a daily basis, given the thousands and thousands of interactions that take place, that we are maintaining those standards as best we can as practicing clinicians and practicing managers.
The follow-up question to that is this. Were you aware that the relationship between at least some parents and patients and the board had deteriorated, so that the view was that there wasn't transparency, and in fact, as you probably know, there was a well-known quote by another senior official that there was it's either a battle or a war or both, presumably with the board on one side and patients on the other. Were you aware of that happening?
I was aware that clearly, as soon as an event or an issue takes place in a clinical area, let's refer to the one we're describing in your inquiries about, clearly the trust and the understanding and the of the parents and the patients and the clinical teams as well as our staff, was deteriorating by the week. And I mean, because there was events taking place every week, either on an IMT or something else, people were asking questions. Some of those questions we did not address or fully address, as we referred to earlier. And when you say the board, of course, the board is, if you like, the top level of the organisation. That really what they meant was management locally in Women and Children's, because we were the face of the organisation. And secondly, the board, in its terms of its communication, would be through the communications team, which of course I was involved with, as was Jamie Redfern, Jen Rogers, Alan Mathers, as part of their roles in briefing around women and children's. But the reality is the board as an entity is a committee as such. But in terms of individuals, clearly that's where you really build trust.
I've nothing furthermore.
Thank you, Mr. Connell. Thank you very much, Mr. Hill. That is now the end of your evidence. Thank you for providing it this morning, but also for the background work that will have gone into preparing that evidence. So thank you very much, but you're now free to break off
Thank you.
communications.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, we will resume again with Mr. Connell leading a witness, Mr.
Mr.
Jenkins,
this afternoon.
If we try and be back for 2:15.